colleagues, and he didn't. And I thought it was a reasonably well-crafted story and was based on facts. Of course, my younger brother never forgave me for writing that story. He recognized himself, so did everyone else. But my regret, I think it is a better novel. And it hasn't done anything, achieved anything like the fame or notoriety Train to Pakistan did. I think the other one has gone into nearly 20 or 30 printings, and the second novel is now on its third printing. After I finished the second novel, I got involved in many other things. But the idea of writing a novel on Delhi been fermenting in my mind. I read Ivo Andrić's novel Bridge on the Drina, which told the story of Yugoslavia on events happening on one bridge. And that gave me the idea that maybe I could tell the story of Delhi in a similar manner using different things. It didn't quite turn out that way. But I started working on it, I think while I was still doing my research on the Sikhs and teaching in Princeton University. I wrote the first chapter, which happened to be a true event. I picked up a person on the road, on the ridge, who turned out to be a hijra. And I dropped him or her at the bus stand, but that made my mind going as a symbol of Delhi, the hijra who could do everything except reproduce. And I thought Delhi was a sterile city. It'd been through so much, but hadn't produced anything very great. And I used this hijra who I had found on the road and my liaison as a narrator, as the continuing chain. It's very weak, I acknowledge it, but it's a tenuous kind of link which brings the history of Delhi from the time of the Rajputs down to the present times up to 1984. I don't know if I succeeded or not. I'm quite happy with the novel because of the different episodes that I was able to recreate from original sources. This is really more like a personal memoir. I was in my 80s, incapable of really having any meaningful physical relationship or even emotional relationship with any person. But the fantasies kept going around my mind of what I could have done if I was younger. And I mentioned right at the beginning of the book that these are when a man gets old, his libidinous desires shift from the middle where they should be to the head where they don't belong. They become fantasies. It's a series of episodes which I myself had admitted earlier on. They were sexual fantasies of an octogenarian. I did not want to publish it, but I happened to talk about it to my publisher, Viking Penguin, David Davida, and he said, let me have a look at it. So I gave it to him, and he appointed his number 2, Ravi Singh, who put it in shape and this and that, and it's been panned by critics mercilessly, I think, without exception. Very few kind words have been said about it, only by a few people who I think did so out of friendship for me rather than the book. And yet for 6 months it was the top of the bestseller list and earned me more royalties than any other book I've written. So I'm not very proud of the book, but it is an honest book, that's all I can say. Honest confession of a man of his in his later years. It needed some courage to write it.
49 East Sujan Singh Park, an exclusive apartment block in South Central Delhi, built by his father before the partition of India, has been Khshvant Singh's permanent abode for the past 4 decades or so. A pilgrimage center of sorts that has been attracting the ugly and the beautiful, seeking recommendations and endorsements, even blessings from its presiding deity. The house has been a silent witness to his changing moods over the years. Having been at the center stage, and despite his oft against the tide comments on social and political upheavals, Khshvant Singh has also been bestowed with various honors and distinctions, the most notable of these being the Padma Bhushan by the President of India in 1974, an award that he returned in 1984 in protest against the state's siege of the Golden Temple in Amritsar. Nomination to the Rajya Sabha from 1980 to 1986, and Heritage of Punjab that enjoys a privileged position in his living room, which also doubles up as a study. Many regard Khshvant Singh to be a better short story writer than a novelist, an opinion that is not much at variance with his feelings in the matter. But the output has been rather limited, a meager 32 in more than 60 years. And most of these have been written when he is not in his Singh Park residence. In fact, whenever the place becomes overpowering and his concentration begins to waver, Khshvant Singh shifts to the solitude of his retreat in the mountains for varying durations, at least 6 times a year. And that's where he was completing many of the incomplete stories.
I know I'm better as a short story writer than a novelist. I don't have the stamina for writing a novel, and novels like Delhi are really a string of short stories. The first one I think I ever wrote was the Punjab Pastoral, sarcastic short story on a good man trying to do good things and not getting anywhere. And that was the first short story I wrote. I didn't have it published. I wrote several after that. I collected them on partition when I came out of Lahore and got a job in the Ministry of External Affairs in London, and gave them to a publisher. And that got published first in England under the title of Vishnu and Other Stories. And that's how it got started. I continued writing short stories in London, and then I was posted in Canada, where some of my stories first saw in print, even before the London collection. They appeared in Harper's Magazine. Pearl Buck was the editor then, and then in several Canadian papers. So I really felt my real métier was the short story. There are some stories which become my favorites because I'm in the, I have a fund of malice inside me, and I try to make fun of people. Of the later stories, one I think entitled The Bottom Pincher. This has become one of my more amusing and light-hearted. I also did one on a Sardarji in Canada who I ran into one day in the street. My short stories are short. I make it a point, because otherwise it becomes long, it becomes a novella. I think it should have a few limited characters, not more than 1 or 2. It should have a beginning, a build-up, and an end, like a scorpion's tail, which leaves the person, the reader, in anticipation of how the story is going to end. I've been wanting to go back, but I've been caught up in this column writing. I feel particularly guilty. I've been pressurized to write short stories. I have quite a few half-written short stories. I'm trying to make up now here to write a series of short stories which remain half-written in the past. But in between I got caught up writing novels and translating works and writing histories of the Sikhs and biographies of people. But I hope before my days are over, I'll complete these short stories as well.
Born in 1915 in Hadali, Punjab, with the proverbial golden spoon in his mouth to Lady and Sir Sobha Singh, and educated at the Government College, Lahore, and at the King's College and the Inner Temple in London, Khshvant Singh has sported different colored turbans in his distinguished and eventful life. Beginning as a lawyer in Lahore, he changed profiles in quick succession to be a writer, diplomat, broadcaster, historian, biographer, editor, and a newspaper columnist. It was therefore imperative that he would author his autobiography at some point in his writing career, and which he has done now in the autumn of his life. An account of life that was endorsed by his late wife, despite herself appearing not in a very favorable light. Now 87, he narrates the story of the publication of his autobiography, once again in his inimitable, no-holds-barred manner.
Mainly at the prodding of my daughter, she said, why don't you write a book for me? Although I had dedicated the very first novel train to Pakistan to her, you write your autobiography specially for me. It will be published by my husband, the royalties will come to me, all that kind of thing. So I did tell her and warn her, I said, you may not like to know what a rascal your father was in his younger days. She said, no, that's all right. Everyone has a background. Or the domestic problems I had in my marriage and various other things. So I wrote about a third of it and gave it to her to decide whether I should go on. And she read it, my wife read it, and they said, go ahead. So I went ahead. I haven't obviously put all, because if you put everything, it may become tedious. So I went ahead with it and handed it over. It was to Ravi Dal, my son-in-law, who's publisher. And in his enthusiasm to give it advanced publicity, offered some chapters to different papers. The India Today carried one dealing with Menaka Gandhi's expulsion from Mrs. Gandhi's home. Suddenly I slapped with a legal notice and the judge, Justice Ramamurthy, granted her an injunction. And it took 6 years for the case to be heard. And ultimately the division bench held in my favor. So the book published 6 years after it should have been in the market. And by then Penguin Viking also became part of it because they wanted to make it a joint publication. And is doing reasonably well. There are many misprints and errors because they did it in a hurry lest she slap another kind of injunction. They produced in a hurry. There are many misprints, many errors of fact which have been rectified in the subsequent editions. And now it's in the market, and I'm told they're already into a third printing. And this above all, to thine own self be true, and it must follow as the night the day, that then thou canst be false to any man.